Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating hypothetical matchups in the entire Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire universe. We're talking about Ser Duncan the Tall versus the infamous Clegane brothers, Gregor and Sandor. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another fan theory video, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't about who's bigger or who looks scarier in armor. This is about actual combat ability, real warrior experience, and the kind of skills that separate legends from brutes. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Duncan would absolutely demolish both of these so-called fearsome fighters. Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, or should I say, the mountain. When most people think about the Clegane brothers, they immediately focus on their size and raw strength. Gregor Clegane stands at nearly 8 feet tall in the books, weighs over 420 pounds of mostly muscle, and can wield a 6-foot greatsword with one hand. That's genuinely terrifying, right? Sandor isn't quite as massive, but at around 6 feet 8 inches and over 300 pounds, he's still an imposing figure who can cleave a man in half with a single swing. These are physical specimens that would make most knights wet themselves just from seeing them approach. But here's where we need to start thinking critically about what actually makes a great warrior in Westeros. Physical size and strength matter, absolutely, but they're far from the whole picture. The entire history of the Seven Kingdoms is filled with examples of smaller, more skilled fighters defeating larger opponents. We saw Oberyn Martell nearly kill Gregor despite being significantly smaller. We saw Bronn explain exactly how he would defeat the Mountain by using speed and tactics. We've seen Jaime Lannister, who isn't particularly huge, be considered one of the greatest swordsmen alive. The pattern is clear to anyone paying attention. Raw power can be overcome by skill, experience, and intelligence. And this is where Ser Duncan the Tall becomes genuinely interesting. Duncan's story is one of the most compelling in all of Martin's work because we actually get to see his evolution as a warrior. When we first meet him in The Hedged Knight, he's basically a half-trained teenager who happens to be exceptionally tall. He's around 16 or 17 years old, stands just under 7 feet tall, and has only received basic instruction from his mentor, Sir Arlen of Pennytree. At this early stage, Duncan isn't particularly skilled. He's clumsy with a lance, his swordsmanship is rudimentary at best, and his main advantages are his reach and his willingness to fight dirty when necessary. He defeats Prince Aerion Targaryen not through superior technique, but by using his size and his street fighting instincts from growing up in Flea Bottom. It's a brutal, ugly victory, but it's a victory nonetheless. What makes Duncan special and what would ultimately make him superior to either Clegane brother is what happens next. Over the years following that first adventure, Duncan doesn't just rely on his natural advantages, he actively works to improve himself. We see this progression through the subsequent Dunk and Egg stories. In The Sworn Sword, Duncan faces Sir Lucas Longinch, and while he still struggles with pure swordsmanship, he demonstrates his growing tactical awareness and his ability to adapt mid-combat. He uses wrestling techniques to compensate for his lack of formal sword training, showing that he understands his own weaknesses and finds ways to work around them. By the Mystery Knight, Duncan has become noticeably more competent. He's still not what you'd call a master swordsman, but he's developing his own style that combines his size, his growing experience, and his willingness to use every tool at his disposal. But the real transformation happens after the events chronicled in the Dunk and Egg novellas. By the time Duncan becomes Lord Commander of the Kingsguard under King Aegon V, he's had decades of combat experience. He's fought in multiple wars, faced countless opponents, and survived challenges that would have killed lesser men. Most importantly, he's fought and defeated some of the most dangerous warriors of his era. Let's talk specifics here because this is where the comparison becomes really interesting. Duncan killed Daemon the Blackfyre in single combat during the Battle of Wendwater Bridge. Now, for those who might not know, the Blackfyres were descendants of Aegon the Conqueror's line, raised in exile with the best training money could buy, surrounded by experienced sellswords and knights. Daemon III wasn't some pampered prince playing at war. He was a legitimately skilled warrior from a family of warriors, and Duncan cut him down in the middle of an actual battle, not in some controlled tournament setting. That's a feat that speaks to real combat ability under genuine life or death pressure. Then there's the duel with Lord Lyonel Baratheon, known as the Laughing Storm. This is perhaps Duncan's most impressive documented victory. Lyonel Baratheon was considered one of the finest fighters of his generation, a man so skilled and fierce that he felt confident declaring himself Storm King and challenging the Iron Throne. He was at the peak of his abilities, fighting for something he genuinely believed in, and Duncan defeated him in a trial by combat. Not barely won, not got lucky, but definitively defeated one of the realm's acknowledged champions. That's the kind of resume that puts you in an entirely different category from the Cleganes. Let's contrast this with what we actually know about Gregor's combat record. Yes, he's killed countless people, but look at who most of his victims actually were. Unarmed peasants, prisoners who couldn't fight back, women and children during the sack of King's Landing. In actual combat against skilled opponents, Gregor's record becomes much less impressive. He loses a joust to Loras Tyrell because Loras uses a clever trick with a mare in heat. He nearly loses to Oberyn Martell and only wins because Oberyn gets cocky and makes a fatal mistake. Against Beric Dondarrion, there's no clear indication that Gregor was particularly dominant. He wins fights, sure, but he wins them through overwhelming physical advantage against opponents who aren't prepared for someone of his size, not through superior skill or tactics. Sandor has a better record than his brother in terms of facing actual skilled opponents, I'll give him that. He holds his own against Gregor himself during their brief fight at the tournament, though notably he doesn't actually try to kill his brother during that encounter. He defeats Beric Dondarrion in a trial by combat, even though Beric had a flaming sword that triggered Sandor's crippling fear of fire. He fights Brienne of Tarth to essentially a draw, though he was already injured and exhausted at the time. These are legitimate accomplishments that show Sandor has real skill beyond just being big and strong. But even at his best, Sandor's fighting style relies heavily on his physical advantages. He uses brute force, heavy strikes, and his intimidating presence to overwhelm opponents. When he faces someone who can match his strength or counter his aggression, like Brienne, the fight becomes much more difficult for him. Now let's talk about what Duncan brings to the table beyond his impressive victories. First, there's the issue of formal training and experience. By the time Duncan reaches his prime, he's had extensive training not just in swordsmanship, but in all the traditional martial skills of Westeros. He's an accomplished jouster, which matters more than you might think. Jousting isn't just about riding a horse and holding a lance steady. It requires incredible balance, spatial awareness, timing, and the ability to maintain control while wearing heavy armor at high speed. Duncan's jousting ability improved dramatically over his career, to the point where he could compete successfully in tournaments against the realm's best knights. This tells us something important about his overall martial development. Duncan also has genuine battlefield experience, not just dueling or tournament fighting. There's a huge difference between facing someone in a controlled environment and fighting in the chaos of an actual battle. In a battlefield situation, you need to maintain situational awareness while under extreme stress, make split-second tactical decisions, manage your stamina, and deal with multiple threats simultaneously. Duncan fought at the Battle of Wendwater Bridge and proved himself in that environment. He participated in conflicts during multiple Blackfyre rebellions. He served as a member and eventually Lord Commander of the King's Guard, which means he spent decades training with and against some of the finest warriors in the Seven Kingdoms. That level of experience creates a depth of knowledge and instinct that you simply can't replicate through raw talent or physical gifts. Let's talk about adaptability, because this is where Duncan really separates himself from the Cleganes. One of the recurring themes in the Dunk and Egg stories is Duncan's ability to learn from his mistakes and adjust his approach. When he realizes his swordsmanship isn't good enough, he doesn't just accept that limitation. He finds ways to compensate, incorporating wrestling, using his environment, and developing tactics that play to his strengths. When he struggles with the lance, he practices and improves until he becomes competent. This might seem like basic stuff, but it's actually quite rare among Westerosi warriors. Most knights, especially those with natural advantages, tend to rely on what works for them and don't really evolve much as fighters. Gregor is the perfect example of someone who never evolved. His fighting style from age 12 to his death appears to have been essentially the same. Put on the heaviest armor possible, wield the biggest sword you can manage, and use your size and strength to bludgeon opponents into submission. It works against most people because most people simply cannot match his physical advantages, but it's also a style with clear exploitable weaknesses. We saw Oberyn demonstrate this perfectly by using speed, reach, and tactics to methodically dismantle Gregor until overconfidence led to his downfall. A more experienced, more disciplined fighter would have finished Gregor off rather than showboating. Sandor shows more adaptability than his brother, which is why he's generally considered the better fighter despite being smaller. He adjusts his tactics based on his opponent, he's willing to use his environment, and he shows actual tactical thinking in combat. But even Sandor has clear limitations. His crippling fear of fire is an obvious weakness that has cost him dearly multiple times. His tendency to drink heavily affects his performance and judgment. His psychological issues with his brother create blind spots in his awareness and decision making. These aren't small problems that you can just ignore when evaluating someone's combat ability. Duncan, by contrast, doesn't have these kinds of debilitating weaknesses. Yes, he's not the most technically skilled swordsman in the realm. Yes, he sometimes doubts himself and his abilities, but these are normal human limitations, not crippling flaws that can be exploited to defeat him. Duncan doesn't have a phobia that makes him freeze up in certain situations. He doesn't have psychological trauma that compromises his judgment in combat. He doesn't rely on alcohol or other substances to cope with his life. These might seem like small advantages, but in a fight between high-level combatants, the person without exploitable weaknesses has a significant edge. Let's consider what an actual fight between Duncan and either Clegane brother would look like. Against Gregor, the matchup becomes really interesting because of the size differential, or rather, the lack thereof. Duncan stands just under 7 feet tall, while Gregor is somewhere between 7 and 8 feet. For the first time in his life, Gregor would be facing someone roughly his own size, someone who can match his reach and potentially his strength. This immediately negates Gregor's primary advantage. Suddenly, Gregor can't just use his sword's superior reach to keep his opponent at bay. He can't rely on being able to strike over his enemy's shield or weapons. Duncan would be right there in his face, and that changes everything. Moreover, Duncan has something Gregor lacks completely: actual technical skill. When you strip away the size advantage, what does Gregor have? He can swing a heavy sword with tremendous force. That's valuable, but it's not enough against someone who knows how to fight properly. Duncan, with decades of training and experience, would be able to read Gregor's attacks, recognize patterns, and exploit openings. He would know how to manage his stamina, when to press an advantage, when to create distance. He's fought enough battles and enough skilled opponents to understand pacing and tactics. Gregor has none of this sophistication. He's basically a very large, very strong man who swings a very big sword at people until they die. That works fine against peasants and poorly trained soldiers. It doesn't work nearly as well against a skilled, experienced warrior who happens to match your physical advantages. The armor situation actually favors Duncan as well. Yes, Gregor wears incredibly thick plate armor that most men couldn't even move in, let alone fight effectively while wearing. But Duncan isn't most men. At just under 7 feet and with the muscular build of someone who's been fighting and training his entire adult life, Duncan could absolutely wear heavy plate armor. He's done so throughout his career. The difference is that Duncan knows how to fight in armor, not just rely on it. He understands angles, leverage points, and the vulnerable spots that exist even in the best plate. Gregor seems to view his armor as simply another physical advantage, trusting it to protect him without really thinking about how to use it strategically. Against Sandor, the matchup is different but equally favorable for Duncan. Sandor is the more skilled fighter of the two brothers, and that means the technical gap between him and Duncan is smaller, but Duncan still has significant advantages. First, there's the size difference. Duncan is notably taller than Sandor, which gives him superior reach. In a sword fight between skilled opponents, reach matters tremendously. It determines who can strike first, who controls distance, who can threaten the other while remaining relatively safe themselves. Duncan's reach advantage isn't as overwhelming as it would be against a normal sized fighter, but it's still meaningful. Second, there's the experience gap. Sandor is described as being in his late 20s during the main events of the series. He's been fighting professionally for maybe 10 or 15 years at most. Duncan, at the point where he's defeating people like Lyonel Baratheon, has been a warrior for 3 or 4 decades. He's seen everything, fought everyone, and survived it all. That kind of experience creates an instinctive understanding of combat that younger fighters simply don't have. Duncan would be able to anticipate Sandor's moves, recognize his patterns, and counter them effectively. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Duncan would be completely unfazed by Sandor's intimidation tactics. One of Sandor's major advantages in fights is his scary appearance and brutal reputation. The burned face, the vicious demeanor, the willingness to use extreme violence, all of these things make opponents nervous and uncertain before the fight even begins. Duncan wouldn't care. He's faced princes and lords, Blackfyre pretenders, and rebel leaders. He's fought in actual wars where people were trying to kill him with every weapon imaginable. A burned face and a bad attitude wouldn't even register as concerning to someone with Duncan's background. Let's also consider the psychological dimension of these matchups. Both Clegane brothers have severe psychological issues that affect their combat effectiveness. Gregor has chronic pain from his gigantism, which contributes to his constantly foul mood and his tendency toward explosive, uncontrolled violence. This might make him more vicious, but it also makes him more predictable and easier to manipulate. An experienced fighter could use Gregor's rage against him, baiting him into mistakes or exhausting attacks. Sandor's fear of fire is well documented and has compromised him in multiple situations. Even without fire present, the psychological trauma from his childhood affects his judgment and decision making. He's driven by anger and hatred toward his brother, which has shaped his entire worldview and approach to conflict. These emotional issues make him a dangerous fighter, but they also create weaknesses that a smart opponent can exploit. Duncan, by comparison, is remarkably psychologically stable for a warrior in Westeros. He has doubts about himself, sure, but those doubts don't paralyze him or cause him to make critical mistakes. He has a clear moral code that guides his actions without making him predictably stupid about it. He understands honor, but isn't so obsessed with it that he can't be practical when necessary. This mental stability is a huge advantage in high-stakes combat situations, where even a moment of hesitation or poor judgment can be fatal. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, maybe Duncan could beat them individually, but surely both brothers together would be too much. And honestly, this is where Duncan's advantages become even more pronounced. Fighting multiple opponents is fundamentally different from dueling, and it requires a specific set of skills that favor Duncan heavily. He has extensive battlefield experience where managing multiple threats simultaneously is essential for survival. He knows how to use positioning to prevent being surrounded, how to force opponents to get in each other's way, how to focus fire on one target while maintaining awareness of others. The Clegane brothers, despite being siblings, don't actually have any demonstrated ability to fight as a coordinated team. In fact, they hate each other to the point where putting them in the same fight would probably create as many problems as it solved. Gregor's fighting style is completely indiscriminate and brutal. He wouldn't care if Sandor was in his swing arc. He'd just kill anything in reach and sort it out later. Sandor would be constantly worried about his brother's position, creating a distraction that Duncan could exploit mercilessly. Let's talk about stamina and endurance for a moment, because this is another area where Duncan has significant advantages. Fighting in full plate armor with medieval weapons is incredibly exhausting. Most people don't realize just how demanding it is to maintain that level of physical exertion for more than a few minutes. Gregor's immense size and strength mean he has tremendous power, but they also mean he's carrying and moving significantly more mass than a normal person. He tires more quickly than you'd expect, which we saw in his fight with Oberyn, where he was notably slowing down as the battle progressed. Duncan, through decades of training and combat, has developed exceptional endurance. He's learned how to pace himself, how to conserve energy, how to fight efficiently rather than just brutally. He can maintain peak performance for extended periods because he's done it countless times before. In a long fight, this becomes a decisive advantage. Even if the Cleganes were initially competitive, Duncan could simply outlast them, waiting for that moment of fatigue where their guard drops and their reactions slow. There's also the question of tactical intelligence, which is perhaps Duncan's greatest advantage over both Clegane brothers. Gregor shows virtually no tactical thinking in his fights. He identifies a target and tries to destroy it with overwhelming force. That's not a tactic, that's just violence. When he faces someone who can counter this approach, like Oberyn, he has no backup plan beyond try harder to hit them. This simplistic approach makes him relatively easy to predict and counter for someone with Duncan's experience. Sandor is more tactically aware than his brother, as we've seen in various fights throughout the series. He uses his environment, recognizes when he's at a disadvantage, and can make tactical decisions in the moment, but his tactical thinking is largely reactive rather than proactive. He responds to situations as they develop rather than setting up scenarios that favor him. Duncan, by contrast, has proven himself capable of genuine tactical planning. He can assess a situation, identify the optimal approach, and execute that plan while remaining flexible enough to adapt if circumstances change. Consider Duncan's fight with Lucas Longinch as an example. Duncan recognized that he was outmatched in pure swordsmanship, so he deliberately maneuvered the fight into a stream where his wrestling advantage and greater strength would be decisive. That's sophisticated tactical thinking. He identified his weaknesses and his opponent's weaknesses, found an environmental factor that would shift the balance in his favor, and executed a plan to create that situation. Neither Clegane brother has demonstrated anything close to that level of tactical sophistication. We should also discuss weapon versatility. Duncan is noted as being competent with multiple weapons, not just a sword. He's good with a mace or axe, he can use a shield effectively, and he has wrestling skills that he's successfully employed in combat. This versatility makes him much harder to prepare for and gives him options that the Cleganes simply don't have. Gregor basically only knows how to use his greatsword in a two-handed grip, though he can wield it one-handed because of his immense strength. Sandor is similar, favoring his sword and occasionally using his fist in tavern brawls, but not showing the kind of weapon variety that indicates true martial versatility. This versatility matters because different combat situations call for different tools. In close quarters, a mace or axe might be more effective than a sword. Against heavily armored opponents, you want something that can deliver concussive force rather than relying on cutting edges. Duncan understands this and can adapt his loadout to the situation. The Cleganes just use what they're comfortable with, regardless of whether it's optimal, which is fine when you're so physically dominant that it doesn't matter, but becomes a liability against an opponent who can match your physical gifts and thinks more strategically. Let's address one final point that often comes up in these discussions: the question of killer instinct. Some people argue that the Cleganes, especially Gregor, have a viciousness and willingness to do whatever it takes to win that gives them an edge over more honorable knights. And there's some truth to this argument. Gregor in particular has no moral boundaries whatsoever. He'll strike when you're down, poison his weapons, ignore the rules of honorable combat completely. Surely that gives him some advantage, right? The problem with this argument is that it assumes Duncan is so bound by honor that he can't fight dirty when necessary. That's not accurate at all. Duncan comes from Flea Bottom, where survival meant fighting with every tool at your disposal. His very first major combat victory against Prince Aerion was achieved by using raw street fighting tactics, not noble knightly swordsmanship. Throughout his career, Duncan has shown himself willing to do whatever it takes to win when lives are on the line. He's not needlessly brutal like Gregor, but he's also not stupid about applying some idealized code of chivalry when actual combat is happening. What Duncan has is the ability to be ruthlessly practical while still maintaining his moral core. He'll fight dirty if that's what winning requires, but he doesn't torture or brutalize opponents unnecessarily. This makes him actually more dangerous than someone like Gregor because Duncan can be just as vicious when needed without the psychological baggage and poor decision making that comes from being genuinely psychopathic. He can flip that switch when necessary and then turn it off again, maintaining his judgment and tactical awareness throughout. So let's bring all of this together and paint the complete picture. Ser Duncan the Tall at his prime, serving as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, is a warrior who combines exceptional size and strength with decades of experience, formal training, tactical intelligence, psychological stability, and proven success against some of the finest fighters of his era. He's defeated Blackfyre pretenders, legendary Baratheon warriors, and countless other opponents across multiple wars and conflicts. He's adaptable, versatile, intelligent, and mentally tough. The Clegane brothers, for all their fearsome reputations, are essentially extremely large, extremely strong men who rely primarily on physical intimidation and brute force. Gregor is basically a killing machine with no finesse, no tactics, and severe physical and psychological issues. Sandor is more skilled and intelligent than his brother, but still heavily dependent on physical advantages and compromised by psychological trauma. Neither brother has fought or defeated anyone on the level of Lyonel Baratheon or Daemon Blackfyre. Neither has demonstrated the tactical sophistication or adaptability that Duncan routinely displays. In a one-on-one fight against either brother, Duncan would have superior reach compared to Sandor and comparable reach to Gregor. He'd have equal or superior strength to Sandor and likely competitive strength with Gregor. More importantly, he'd have vastly superior technique, tactics, and experience compared to both. He wouldn't be intimidated by their reputations or appearances. He wouldn't make rookie mistakes or get baited into emotional responses. He'd fight smart, patiently, looking for openings while protecting himself from their power. And when that opening came, he'd exploit it with the kind of decisive action that comes from 4 decades of combat experience. Against both brothers simultaneously, Duncan would be at a numerical disadvantage, but he'd also be facing opponents who don't work well together and who would likely create as many problems for each other as they would for him. His superior tactics and battlefield awareness would allow him to manage the engagement, while his endurance would let him outlast them in an extended fight. The bottom line is this: the Clegane brothers are scary because of their size, strength, and willingness to be brutal. But Duncan the Tall is scary because he's a legitimately elite warrior who happens to also be huge. Size and strength, plus decades of high-level experience and proven success against legendary opponents, beat size and strength without those additional factors every single time. It's not even really that close when you break it down objectively. So yes, Ser Duncan the Tall would absolutely destroy the Clegane brothers in any reasonable combat scenario. Not might, not could, but would. The evidence is overwhelming once you look past the superficial similarities and actually examine what makes these fighters effective. Duncan is simply operating at a different level than either Clegane brother ever reached. He's the complete package: physical gifts plus technical skill plus experience plus intelligence plus mental toughness. That combination makes him one of the greatest warriors in the entire history of Westeros, and certainly far superior to a pair of oversized brutes who mistake violence for valor and brutality for battle prowess. Thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know in the comments if you agree or if you think the Cleganes would have a chance. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the combat abilities of Westeros' finest, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more content like this. Until next time, stay legendary.